Today, we're diving into something really chilling. It's a first-hand account from a U.S. Navy flight engineer, and he's talking about things he saw in Antarctica that were so secret he was basically told to forget they ever happened. Just imagine hearing that. What you saw, you did not see. That's where this whole story kicks off. It's not just a command to be quiet, It's an order to literally deny what your own eyes have told you. That right there tells you we're dealing with something huge. And this wasn't some off-the-cuff comment. This warning was given directly to a flight engineer, we'll just call him Brian for this story, and his whole crew. Why? Because they'd just flown across a forbidden zone in Antarctica and saw something they were definitely not supposed to see.
All right, so let's get into the first piece of this puzzle. Section 1, the hole in the ice. Yeah, it's as wild as it sounds. The whole chain of events that led to that warning, it started with them finding something that just shouldn't be there. A giant, mysterious hole at the bottom of the world.
So picture this. It all kicks off as just another day at the office for these guys. A totally standard resupply mission. But then, bam, an emergency medevac call comes in. Someone needs to be evacuated, and fast. To save precious time, they have to make a call. And they decide to cut straight through a designated no-fly zone near the South Pole. That one decision, that one shortcut, well, it changed everything for them. Now, you might be wondering, why was this a no-fly zone? Well, the official story was pretty boring. It was just an air sampling station. Nothing to see here, folks. But what Brian's crew actually saw, it was anything but boring. They saw a massive, gaping hole in the ice. We're talking the size of a football field. He said it was so big, you could probably fly their C-130 right into it. This was no crack in the ice. It didn't look natural at all. So, they get back from this flight, and you'd expect a pretty intense debriefing, right? But it was weird. There was no paperwork, no official write-up. Instead, this mysterious guy in plain green fatigues shows up. He looks every single crew member right in the eye and gives them that order we started with. A verbal command. Just forget what you saw.
And that just makes you think, right? Why do it like that? In the military, in the government, everything is about paperwork, non-disclosure agreements, official records. That's standard procedure. So why just a verbal warning? Maybe, just maybe, whatever they saw was so sensitive they couldn't risk creating a paper trail. A verbal threat, it disappears into thin air.
Okay, so a giant hole in the ice is weird enough. But the story doesn't stop there. It actually gets even stranger. The mystery kind of pivots from a weird thing they saw in the ice to something deeply disturbing that happened to a group of people. Which brings us to our second section, the silent scientists. So here's how it went down. A team of scientists from the National Science Foundation gets dropped off at their remote camp. Everything's normal. They're supposed to do these routine radio check-ins, right? It's mandatory. But then, just silence. The radio goes dead. After 2 days of nothing, Brian's crew gets the call to go fly out there and see what's going on.
And keep in mind, these weren't a bunch of newbies. These were seasoned, veteran researchers. They knew Antarctica. But what the crew found, it wasn't the same people they dropped off. Brian's description is just chilling. He said they looked hollow. They were trembling, frightened, to the point where they could barely even move. Something out there terrified them into a complete shutdown. And the whole situation afterwards was just as strange. Every single one of the 15 scientists totally silent, not a word. And the research gear? It was immediately taken away and locked up in a separate quarantined building. The crew was told in no uncertain terms, don't go near that stuff. And then the rumor started flying that all that gear was being shipped off to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The place with a bit of a reputation for interesting research. And just when you think it can't get any more like a movie, the intimidation ramps up. The crew gets debriefed again, but this time, the guy in the military fatigues is gone. Instead, there are 2 men in dark suits. You know the type. These guys were clearly not part of the normal military structure, but their message? Exactly the same. You saw nothing? You say nothing. So we've had a mystery hole and silent scientists on the ground, but the weirdness wasn't just happening down on the ice. The next part of Brian's story takes us up into the air, over one of the most isolated places on the entire planet. Let's talk about the silver discs they saw.
This happened on what they called a milk run, just a totally routine flight, shuttling supplies and people. They're flying along the Transantarctic Mountains, which are just massive. And the loadmaster is looking out the window when he sees these weird flashes of light bouncing off the mountain peaks.
So they all start looking, and what they see just doesn't make sense. It's a group of 4 or 5 shiny silver discs flying in a perfect formation. And the way they moved was impossible. They would just stop on a dime, hover, then make these instant, sharp right-angle turns. Moves that would literally turn any human pilot inside into jelly. But here's another really weird detail. They were pacing the C-130, but they never, ever crossed this invisible boundary over the Beardmore Glacier. It was like they were respecting a border.
You know, nobody on the flight deck wanted to be the first one to say it out loud. But then Brian and the loadmaster had this little exchange. Brian kind of jokes, flying saucers, and the loadmaster just looks at him, smiles a little, and says, "Well, that's what I thought too." In that one moment, the joke wasn't a joke anymore. They both knew they were looking at something completely out of this world.
Okay, so fast forward. Years go by. Brian finishes his career, he retires. You think that's the end of the story, right? But whatever secrets are buried in that ice, they have a very, very long memory. And that brings us to the final and maybe the most chilling part of his story, a final warming. We're talking decades after he left the Navy. Brian is at a conference, and he decides to tell a couple of people these stories in private. Nothing public, just a quiet conversation. The very next Monday, he's at his new job, a high-security aerospace firm where you just don't get outside calls, and his personal cell phone rings. That alone is weird.
He answers. And the guy on the other end of the line, he knows everything. He knows Brian was at the conference. He knows who he talked to. He even knew about a conversation they had in a restaurant parking lot. And then he drops this bombshell, this very specific warning, not about the hole, not about the discs, but about the missing scientist from all those years ago.
So who on earth was this? Who has that kind of surveillance power to know all those tiny details? And more importantly, why do they still care so much about a story from a retired Navy guy that happened decades ago?
Well, while he was still on the call, Brian had the presence of mind to do a reverse search on the phone number. And what came back was just terrifying. The call was coming from the general phone number for the NSA headquarters in Fort Meade, Maryland. This wasn't just some crank call. This was a message, a serious show of force.
So when you put it all together, a football field-sized hole in the ice, brilliant scientists scared into silence, UFOs making impossible turns, and then, decades later, a threatening phone call from the NSA. It all leads to one single massive question. What secrets are buried under the Antarctic ice that are so important, so world-changing, that they demand a half-century of absolute, enforced silence?